I am going to be speaking on a little bit of whole person health. So I do want to give a brief kind of overview. If you're unfamiliar with the Nebraska Safety Council, we are a nonprofit that has been serving the entire state of Nebraska since 1961. And we take this really unique approach where we really focus on this 360 view of the worker. And we do that through several affiliations. We are affiliated with the Healthier Workforce Center of the Midwest. And through that, we are also affiliated with NIOSH and the CDC. And through these affiliations, we promote and we push this total worker health, this total worker well-being initiative that kind of leans into that worker 360 view. We want to look at our workforce from all of these angles and really start to integrate worker safety, worker health, and worker well-being. But to tag into the Nebraska Safety Council mission, we try and provide this education, this training, these support services for our employees, but not just at work. We want to make sure that we are supporting people so that they can be healthy and safe at home and on the road as well. And that leads me into some stats. And I will, for some of you who may not know me, I am not a huge believer in presenting a lot of negative statistics. I like to lean into the positive, wellness, happy, la, 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 la. But I do have to point out that there are things that make what I'm talking about today so relevant. And what we're seeing are multiple different epidemics that are happening right now. The first being that there is an epidemic of stress, depression, and anxiety, which means that like 60 to 90% of doctors' visits right now are due to anxiety. And the number one disability for workers worldwide right now is related to burnout. Then we look at this epidemic of sleep deprivation. And we see that 2 to 3 adults right now are not meeting their minimum sleep requirements. And I have a little stipulation with this one, okay? I have a 4-year-old and I have a 1-year-old. I am not choosing to be not having my sleep. This deprivation is not my fault. But in relative to it still being kind of a levity, like sleep deprivation, there's a lot of things that can impact that, children or no children. It is still an epidemic. And it leads into some other things as well, where we're having these epidemics of obesity, and we're seeing that we are the first nation that is both overfed and undernourished. And what that means is we are eating too much, and we are still missing some of the essential nutrients that we need to be well and safe and healthy. So we're eating things which probably taste delicious, but we're still missing some of those essential nutrients, and that's leading into this obesity epidemic. And there's also an epidemic of physical inactivity where about 20% of adults there's more than 20% of adults who are missing the benefit of physical inactivity. And why I bring these all together is because they show a cycle of behaviors, right? So if we look at people who are maybe stressed or having anxiety or depression, they may not be sleeping well. I know in preparation for today, I was maybe a little bit nervous, right? I have to talk to all you people. I was a little stressed. I didn't sleep as well, right? So I can tell you the thought of then being a little bit stressed, being a little bit sleep deprived, and then having to think about, do I hit the gym on the way home? Where what I want to do is go home, put on my pajamas, and go to bed early, right? If we're seeing that cycle of behavior, sleep deprivation, now I'm not wanting to move my body as much for getting that physical inactivity component, that can lead to us carrying maybe a little bit of extra weight, right? These cycles of behaviors that are all feeding into some of these total worker well-being needs. And this is so relevant, and I sit here and I talk about this stuff, and I hate to bring up the P word. I know no one wants to talk about the pandemic anymore, but it is relevant to talk about this in relation to what we're discussing today, because through the pandemic, basically, all of these areas of health, all of these concepts of whole person health and total worker well-being were impacted. People were not maybe going out as much. They were not going to the gym as much because they weren't sure if they could, if they could not. They weren't going to work. Maybe you pivoted to remote. I don't know about you guys, but if I was working remote, for me to walk to the bathroom was like 2 steps away, which if I'm at work, walking to the bathroom is like maybe down the hall. I'm not walking to the copier and getting printouts, right? There was an impact to our physical activity during the pandemic, which then through that cycle of behaviors leads into maybe a higher risk for blood pressure because we're not moving well, we're not managing some of that stress. Maybe higher risk for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, etc. So we saw the pandemic impact physical well-being. It also impacted emotional well-being, mental well-being. There was a lot of chaos. There was a lot of unknowns. There was a lot of things that were causing us stress. And then we were not able to manage that as well during the pandemic. An offshoot of that is social well-being. We were isolated for quite a while, not seeing our families, not seeing our friends, people that we lean into for some of that social and emotional well-being. That had an impact. And then financial well-being as well, through myriad of things I've just talked about, stress, unknowns, job loss, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things were trending in that direction prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic basically lit that match and sent all of those trajectories skyrocketing, and we are still seeing this now. Why I'm bringing up the pandemic is because we are still recovering from this, yes? And we see that because we have stressed out, burnt out, overwhelmed employees, and especially people who are working with other people on a day-to-day basis where you're giving of yourself over and over and over all day, all day, all day. By the time you get home, you may not have anything left for yourself. And you may not know what resources are available for you to start to reinvest in yourself, right? And this is relevant when we're not taking care of our employees and we start to see some of these economic impacts, where we have poor worker health costs at $575 billion a year, and we have 90% of the nation's $4.1 trillion in annual healthcare costs due to chronic diseases and mental health conditions. So this is incredibly relevant, but I will say, I told you earlier, don't love negative stats, but the numbers, thinking about the ROI, thinking about the bottom dollar, thinking about these chronic health statistics, knowing that that is real and that is important, but people are our most valuable asset. We have such a unique opportunity to make an impact because workers spend most of their day at work. Being able to have the ability to impact their health and their safety at work can then have an impact on some of these statistics. And you may say, great, Kelsey, I love it. What does that mean? How do we do this? That is where this total worker well-being approach comes into play. This is how we can start to make a difference for our employees who've been juggling all of the things that I have just talked about. And if you need a formal definition, total worker well-being is the approach that focuses on how the workplace environment and the health of the employee can impact the overall well-being of the individual. Because what we find out is if there is something happening outside of work in their life from a physical, emotional, whatever aspect, that is going to impact their time at work. That doesn't just stop at the door anymore. Same thing, if something's happened at work, it doesn't stop on the door on the way out. So we have to be thinking, what can we do to support our people? I love leaning into these dimensions of wellness, and I've kind of alluded to some of these thus far. But we have to understand that every individual is different. Every company is going to have unique individuals and unique needs for your groups of people, and that everybody wants to be seen in some capacity. One of my other favorite things to say is every single person's journey in any lifestyle change at all, wellness, doesn't matter. Anybody's journey is going to have a different starting line and a different finish line. So we need to start thinking, how do we meet people where they're at? And I think the opportunity that an LSA provides is such a perfect bridge of saying, what are these individual needs at these companies, and how can we then tie that into how we support them into those resources? How can we make sure that their needs are being met so that they can just be really healthy and safe people, right? And I'm gonna give you guys a really goofy example, so just bear with me, but I'm a visual learner, and so I'm gonna try and give you a visual picture of why thinking about this multifaceted approach is so important. So let's say every single one of you is carrying a bunch of 6 balloons that aligns with those 6 components of well-being you just saw, right? And you're walking along through your journey of life or your journey that day or whatever, and something snags one of your balloons. And you kind of get yanked back, right? Because you can no longer move forward. Yourself and those other 5 balloons are tied to that one that is holding you back. And I always lean into this example that I had when I was health coaching one day. And she was like, Kelsey, my focus is just to get out of bed today. It doesn't matter what I eat. It doesn't matter if I move my body, because all of my energy is spent channeling into how do I just function. So the balloon that was holding her back might have been that emotional well-being balloon. She did not have the resources or the knowledge or whatever to unsnag that balloon and move forward. And that is where, again, LSAs can come into play and the Nebraska safety can come into play because we can provide the knowledge, the resources, the education, the training on how we can set up well-being programs to unsnag those balloons for all of the different people that we work with and that we care about. So you might say, cool, okay, love it. Where do we actually start? If this is something that I want to implement, these are kind of the frameworks that I tend to lean into when I'm working with companies on how to map this out for them. The first and foremost thing we want to get is a form of leadership commitment. And that might be an opportunity to take some of the stats that we've talked about today, some of those hard numbers, some of the stories, and you go to them and say, if we want to make a difference, if we want to retain our employees and we want to bring in other employees to our businesses, to Lincoln, to our state, if we want to bring in this talent and retain this talent, this is how we need to start supporting our people. And you go in and you have that presentation with leadership, and leadership is like, done, yes, on board, love it. That's your first step. But it does not end there. It's awesome when they say it and they communicate it out, but then we need to get to the point that we're integrating now this culture shift of total worker well-being, of whole person health. We need to start integrating that into systems and teams. One very easy place to start is starting to establish a wellness and safety committee. Now, some of you may already have a wellness committee or a safety committee, but I encourage you, if you don't merge the committees together full time, at least have opportunities throughout the year where that group, those two groups of people come together, because wellness begets safety, safety begets wellness. You can't have one without the other, and identifying that and creating all those resources for work and at home, again, is one of those best ways to move forward. You can also look at implementing people like wellness and safety champions throughout the organization to help also be another layer of look at all of these things we're doing, championing all of those initiatives. The next thing you can start to do is start to actually look at your work site and identify, I say hazards, but look at things in your environment that you might be able to have an impact on to help support the initiatives. My favorite is always to go to the break room and see what is available in the break room. Is it health assisting or is it health making it a little bit harder, right? And I will say nothing is off the table. There are no bad foods, but thinking about what can we do to make it just a little bit more tangible for our employees. So that's a decent example. But my favorite one when I talk to companies about this is I love doing data collection and data analysis. Because if the whole point of this is to identify what your companies need, what your employees need, get that data, whether that is health screening data, whether that is health risk assessment data. Get that data so you can get those aggregate reports and dig in and say, oh my gosh, this and this and this are our 3 priorities to make sure that our workforce is feeling heard and supported. You get that data, and again, that's where you can start to tag in those LSAs as an option, because you can say, look, we need to be putting assistance to these areas. This is what our employees need. This is what our individuals need to be successful. After you do that data collection, you analyze the data and you start to establish those actual protections. The next thing, the best thing that you can do to engage and sustain this is to keep assessing. Every year, re-engage, recollect that data, get that PHA data, that personal health assessment data, because it'll continue to tell you a story and continue to show that you guys are invested in making sure that needs are met year over year, because people change. Employment changes. You get new employees in and other employees out. That's a great way to just make sure we're continuing this whole story. And I've given you a few stats today that were kind of national data. I then actually went into our Nebraska Safety Council data. I wanted to get local data because at the end of the day, we're looking at our employees, our city of Lincoln, correct? So I went in and I looked at what are the members that we have that are using these total worker well-being initiatives, what differences are we seeing? And we saw a 10% decrease in the high risk category for HDL cholesterol, 9% decrease in the high-risk category for triglycerides, 23% decrease for the high-risk category of glucose. And if you guys are at all familiar with glucose or with diabetes, that's a hard disease. That's a rough disease. It's also a pretty financially hefty disease. So the fact that we're seeing a 23% decrease for the high-risk category of glucose, I think is phenomenal to be recognizing that that is happening. And then we also saw an 11% decrease in tobacco use. And what these all come together and show is that there is an overall decrease in these high-risk metabolic syndrome cases by leaning into and building a whole person health culture, a total worker well-being culture. And I will say, a little point of pride on behalf of these companies. This was through the pandemic. They continued to collect this data through that pandemic, which I think is such a beautiful representation of the resiliency of these companies and these employees to be able to navigate something like that and still move in a positive direction. So you can see there's even some emotional and mental well-being pieces at play there. And I just think with the data and the resources that I have experienced at my time with the Nebraska Safety Council, I think leaning into total worker well-being, leaning into these LSAs can be it can make Lincoln a champion in this idea of a culture shift. And I think, again, leaning into retention and engaging employees, there's such an opportunity here.